People say that, but I don't consider myself that. I mean, I just played at a time and someone wanted to buy me, so they paid the money for me. And I followed a guy called George Best. People ask you these things when you get older, don't they? Who was the best? Who frightened you? Who could do things you couldn't do? And I never really know what to say straight away. Because football wasn't like that when we were playing. You didn't come off the pitch and start making lists. Half the time you were thinking about your sore ankle getting something to eat, or whether the manager was going to have a go at you in the morning. But I tell you what does happen. Years later, certain faces come back. You can forget the score of a match. I have plenty of them. Somebody will say, Kev, remember that game? And I'll look at them and think, not really. Then they'll mention a player. Now I remember. I remember the way he moved. I remember standing there thinking, where's he gone now? I remember looking at one of my teammates after somebody had done something ridiculous and neither of us had to say a word. That's the funny thing. I played with some wonderful footballers, played against plenty as well. England, Liverpool, Hamburg, all over the place. And I was fortunate because I saw these fellas from a few yards away, not from the stands, not on television, right there. You learn a lot about a player from that distance. You learn who's really quick. You learn who doesn't panic. And you certainly learn which ones you don't want running at you again. Now 5 names. Give me another day and I might argue with myself and change one. But these 5, no, I think I'd stick with these 5. And the first fellow I'm thinking of, goodness me, he could play Cruyff. Yeah. You couldn't really watch Johan Cruyff and forget him, could you? The first thing people talk about is the skill, and of course he had plenty of that. Lovely touch, quick feet, he could beat you. But that wasn't really the thing that stayed with me. It was his head. He seemed to know where everybody was before anybody else did. I remember watching him and thinking, how's he seen that? Because sometimes the pass wasn't even there when he first got the ball. Then he'd move a yard, somebody else would move, and suddenly he'd put it through a gap that you hadn't noticed. That used to annoy me a little bit, actually. Not him personally, just the fact that somebody could make it look so easy. I had to work at things. I always did. Running, finishing, movement, fitness. I'd keep going until I got something right. Cruyff looked as though he'd worked it all out before he'd put his boots on. And he was skinny, wasn't he? You'd look at him and think, well, somebody ought to be able to knock him over. Good luck. You had to catch him first. That Dutch side he played in was something else. Everybody remembers the orange shirts and all that movement, but Cruyff was the fellow your eyes kept going back to. He'd be up front, then he'd disappear, then you'd find him somewhere completely different. And the strange thing was, everybody around him seemed to understand it. That's rare. There have been more powerful players, probably quicker players as well. I've seen men hit a football harder. But Cruyff understood the game in a way very few people ever have. You could nick little things from watching plays like that. A movement here, a turn there. With Johan though, sometimes you just watched and thought, no, I'm not even going to try that. Franz was different. I knew that before I went to Germany, obviously. Everybody knew Beckenbauer. You didn't need to be some great student of football to know who he was. But when you actually saw him, that was something else. He never seemed to be in a hurry. I never understood that. I spent half my life in a hurry. Running here, chasing there, trying to get half a yard on somebody. Franz could walk into a situation that looked like a complete mess and somehow come out the other side with the ball at his feet. And his shirt would still be clean. That used to make me laugh. You'd have players flying into tackles, people shouting somebody on the ground, and Franz would just glide away from it all as if he'd been told beforehand where everybody was going to be. When I moved to Hamburg, I began to understand Germany a little better. Football over there was serious, very serious. They expected things to be done properly. And Franz, to me, represented that confidence. Not arrogance. There's a difference. He simply looked like a man who knew exactly how good he was. I remember thinking that if I'd tried to play football with that sort of calmness, I'd probably have driven myself mad after 5 minutes. It wasn't in me. I wanted to run. I wanted to get involved. Franz could control a match without looking as though he was doing very much at all. That's a gift. And he could play, goodness me. People sometimes talk about defenders as though their job is just to stop somebody else. Franz could do that, of course, but then he'd take the ball and suddenly he was starting the next attack. You couldn't really pin him down as one thing. Defender, midfielder, footballer. That's what he was. Just a wonderful footballer. And whenever people ask me about the great German players, I saw Franz is always there. He has to be, because there aren't many players who can make a difficult game look quiet. Franz could. George. Now, George was something. I remember people talking about him when I was still trying to make my own way in football. You'd hear the stories, obviously, everybody did, but then you'd see him with the ball and think, right, that's what they're talking about. He had that little bit of magic. I don't know how else to put it. George could get the ball with 2 or 3 men around him and somehow come out with it. And the annoying part was that sometimes he looked as though he wasn't even trying that hard. I'd have been pumping my arms, working away, making it look like hard labour. George would drop a shoulder and be gone. You'd think, oh, come on, that's not fair. And he was brave. People forget that. The pitches weren't lovely carpets. Defenders weren't standing there admiring you. If you embarrassed somebody once, there was a fair chance he'd make sure you remembered him the next time you went past. George kept going back at them again and again. That's what I admired. Plenty of people have tricks when nobody's touching them. Try doing it when somebody's just kicked you up in the air and you know he's waiting for you again. George did. There was something about the way he carried the ball. It almost looked attached to him. He could slow down, tempt you in, and then suddenly he was away. You knew what was coming. Didn't make much difference. I always thought the really great players had something that made people want to watch them, even if they didn't support their club. George had that. Manchester United weren't my team, obviously, far from it. But if George Best was playing, you'd watch. You wanted to see what he'd do. And that's probably one of the greatest compliments you can give a footballer. Because years later, you don't remember every result. You remember the fellow who made you get out of your seat. George did that. Oh, he definitely did that. Bobby was a lovely footballer. And I don't just mean technically. There was something about the way he played that looked right. I know that sounds a bit daft, but that's how I remember him. Nothing unnecessary. He'd get the ball, lift his head, and off he'd go. And once Bobby started running with it, you noticed the power. People sometimes remember the gentleman first because that's what he was off the pitch. Quiet fellow, dignified, never seemed interested in making a fuss about himself. Then he'd hit a football. Good grief. You didn't want to be standing in the way of one of those. I watched him when I was younger like everybody else did. That England team in the 60s was part of your football education, really. Bobby Moore, Gordon Banks, Nobby Stiles, all those fellas. But Charlton always caught my eye. Maybe because I could understand a little bit of what he was doing. Not that I could do it as well as him. Let's get that straight. But I like players who wanted to go forward, get the ball and make something happen. Don't fiddle around with it for the sake of looking clever. Take responsibility. Bobby did that. And there was no nonsense about him. That's important to me. You meet enough great players over the years and you realise the best ones don't always need to tell you how good they are. Everybody else already knows. Bobby was like that. I got to know him better through England, and I always had enormous respect for him. You could sit and talk football with Bobby without feeling that he was trying to impress you. He'd already done everything. What was there to prove? And I think that's why people loved him. They respected the player, obviously, but they trusted the man as well. There aren't many footballers who become bigger than the club shirt they're wearing without ever seeming to chase that sort of attention. Bobby did. When people talked about English football around the world, they knew Bobby Charlton. And rightly so, because before my generation came along and started having our own adventures, fellows like Bobby had already shown us what a great English footballer could look like. Pele. Yeah, I think it has to be Pele. You can argue about football forever, that's half the fun of it. Somebody will say Cruyff, somebody else will say Maradona. Younger people have Messi and Ronaldo, and fair enough, they're entitled to their players. But for my generation, Pelé was different. He almost didn't seem real. You'd hear about this fella from Brazil who'd been playing in World Cup since he was a kid, scoring goals, doing extraordinary things, and Remember, we didn't have football coming out of the television every hour of every day. You waited to see these people. So when Brazil came along, you watched. And Pelé, goodness me, he could do everything. That's the bit I always come back to. People remember the goals and the lovely Brazilian football, but look at the man properly. He was strong, quick, brilliant in the air, 2 good feet, clever around the box. Try finding a weakness. I couldn't. And he had imagination. That's something statistics will never explain properly. A great player sometimes sees something and you think, why would you even try that? Pelé would try it. I remember that dummy against Uruguay and Mexico. He lets the ball run one side of the goalkeeper and goes around the other. He didn't even score. And we're still talking about it. That's football. Sometimes the thing that stays in your head isn't the goal, it's the idea. I loved that about him. And there was another thing with Pelé. He carried this enormous reputation everywhere. Everybody wanted to see him. Everybody wanted something from him. Yet when the ball arrived, he still looked like a boy, enjoying football. That's difficult. Pressure can make players tight. It can make them frightened of making mistakes. Pelé seemed free. I was lucky. I saw some wonderful footballers in my life, and I'd never pretend choosing one is easy. But if you sit me down and say, come on, Kev, one name. All right, Pelé. I'd give you Pelé. Funny, isn't it? You start talking about 5 footballers and suddenly you're back there again. You can almost smell the dressing room. Liniment, wet grass, muddy boots, somebody shouting down the corridor, somebody laughing about something that probably wasn't funny at all. That's what football becomes when you're older. Memories. And I'm sure somebody will tell me I've got the list wrong. That's fine. Football would be terribly boring if we all agreed. Somebody will say, what about Maradona? Wonderful player. What about Kenny Dalglish? Oh, Kenny could play. And there are plenty more. I could sit here all afternoon doing this. But the 5 I've mentioned gave me something different to remember. Cruyff made me think about the game differently. Beckenbauer had that extraordinary calmness. George Best could make you smile just by getting the ball. Bobby Charlton represented so much of what I admired about English football. And Pelé. Well, Pelé was Pelé. I don't think he needs much help from me. The strange thing is, when you're young, you think football is about winning everything. You want the medal, you want the cup, you want people to say you were the best. I certainly did. I was competitive, probably too competitive sometimes. But later on, you realise you were very lucky just to be there. I got to play at Anfield, I played for England, I went to Germany when people thought I was mad. I stood on football pitches with men I'd watched and admired myself. That's not a bad life, is it? Not bad at all. And maybe that's why I still enjoy talking about these fellows. Because for all the arguments about who's greater than who, the important thing is much simpler. They made us love football. I know they made me love it. And after all these years, I think that's probably the best thing you can say about any player.